Welcome. So glad to have everybody here. Thanks for coming to Commonwealth Bookstore. Thanks for being part of our community for many years or many months or days or weeks or however long you've been joining us. We're so glad to have you. Because you support a brick and mortar bookstore, we are able to have flesh and blood authors come and visit us. Thank you for not meeting these two fabulous people in a warehouse in Elizabethtown. I don't know.
I got Amazon fulfillments here like right down there.
And yet here we are all together tonight. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your support as we do these events. It really has given me a huge charge because I love seeing all your beautiful faces. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've got a really special one. I'm just meeting Chris for the first time over in person today, over email in the last several weeks. He's created this terrific sci-fi weird fiction book called These Prisoning Hills. Its debut, it just came out. So yeah, brand new book, and it's really inspiring and interesting book. So I encourage everybody to check it out. We will close the bookstore at 8 p.m. So about 10 minutes prior, give everybody a chance to shop in there, and then close down that section. We can kind of hang out here for a little while longer. Exit out Bailey Avenue. Okay, so everybody relax, take your time. But last call for books is at 7:50. So, and Alix's book is totally sold out. Just so you all know. Paperback comes out August 16th, so definitely feel free to put in a pre-order at the counter. We'll make sure we get you a copy.
Summer Suns.
Spine tingling. If you haven't read it yet, highly recommend it. As you may know, Lee Mandelo is a writer, critic, and occasional editor whose fields of interest include speculative and queer fiction, especially when the two coincide. And happy Pride Month to all of us. All right, and happy birthday to Alvin Ginsberg tomorrow. He's one of my favorites. They've been a past nominee for various awards, including the Nebula, Lambda, and Hugo. Their work can be found in magazines such as Tor.com, Uncanny Magazine, Clark's World, and Nightmare. Aside from a brief stint overseas learning to speak Scouse, I'll have to ask you about that later. Mandela has spent her life ranging across Kentucky, currently living in Lexington and pursuing a PhD at the University of Kentucky. And Christopher Rowe, our friend here, is the author of the acclaimed story collection Telling the Map, as well as a middle grade series, The Supernatural Sleuthing Service, co-written with his wife, author Gwenda Vaughn. He has been a finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, World Fantasy, Newcom, and Theodore Sturgeon Awards. He lives in a 100-year-old house in Lexington with his wife and their many right around corner from Lee. Oh.
Literally on the same block.
It's all neighborhood love over here. Let's everybody give a very warm round of applause and congratulate Christopher Rowe.
You know, this is a great crowd, and I can say that because I know almost every one of you. The way this is going to work is there's going to be a brief reading and some stuff, and then Lee is going to pitch me softballs all night long with my hoe. I'm just going to dump you right in the middle of this. This is about halfway through the novella. Now, I've told you about Alexander and how he left the Mediterranean to try and conquer all of Asia. Marcia took a swig of filtered water from her canteen and ran through the reports the scouts had turned in. She was only half listening to what Carter was saying to the off-duty infantry of the expeditionary force and to the gathered members of his own Crow war band. And I told you about the Carthaginian general, Hannibal, who so frightened the Romans. Tell that one again, said Alma, Carter's acidic second. I like the elephants. Carter's stories have proven good for morale. In the 2 weeks, the Federals and the Crows had been dug in together. So Marcia had not stopped for practice. She hadn't even commented on it. She liked the Crow leader, and he liked her. But they got along best when they weren't speaking directly to one another. If you want elephants, go to Africa. This is a different story, a different kind of story. Maybe I will go to Africa, answered Alma. Which way is it? She looked around and unusually let her eyes come to rest on Marcia. She and Alma did not know one another. Marcia pointed southeast. Carter ignored the wordless exchange. Alexander had a second cousin. You Easterners may not keep track of your relations as closely as we do here in the Commonwealth, but trust me, second cousin means something. This cousin's name was Pyrrhus of Epirus, and Hannibal said that he was the greatest military commander the world had ever seen. Where is that? Asked Alma. Where's Epirus? She looked at Marcia again. Marcia shrugged. Greece, said Carter. This is a Greece versus Rome story. Alma stood up. She said, it's an empire story then. Nobody wins and knows. Then she sulked off into the dark. Pyrrhus beat the Romans, Carter called after his retreating second. Then, lowering his voice, he said to those still listening, more or less. I'm going to align a few pages here to move to where the Crows under Carter and the federal troops under Marcia are preparing to face a very strange enemy in battle. You'll see in the cover of the book. The combined force was assembled, equipped, and moving up the ridge far more quickly than Marcia would have thought possible, especially in the dark. Part of it was the Crows had only to pull on their regalia and pick up their weapons, which they slept with, and then stand around in loose knots while Marcia's troops made their own considerably more complex preparations. But the other part of the quickness to the march was that those preparations were made with considerable efficiency and speed, even with alacrity. She was proud of how it was done. She was proud of those who had done it. Now her troops were strung out, moving up onto the heights stealthily, keeping a careful 5 meters apart prescribed for these circumstances, or something like these circumstances anyway. Marcia didn't know why she was bothering maintaining discipline and following procedures. The Crow warband was scrambling every and any which way. And as they went, they sang. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is my mic on?
Yes.
Yes.
Yours is not.
Mine is not.
Oh,
I don't know how to resolve that.
Here comes an AV guy.
Yay!
Yes? Wow.
Oh,
Yes.
God.
Thank you.
Alix has been studying for years for this very moment.
Yeah, for as you can tell, I have not been preparing for that moment. So, the book is out now.
It is.
I'm going to give you the softball intro question first.
Okay.
What kind of book is this? Tell us
It's,
a little
well, it's about 150 pages long. I believe the trim size is 6 by 10, something like that. This is a science fiction book, a novella, in Tor.com's very exciting novella program. And it is about a post-apocalyptic or dystopian future in southeastern Kentucky, pretty much. And there's giant robots in it.
I wrote up several questions. I'm very prepared. So this one is a standalone, but it's also part of other stories that you've done, like
It is.
Voluntary State in 2004. So
Mhm.
how does it feel to return to those things?
I returned to it once with my in what is either a very long novella or a very short novel, depending on when you're a member of the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America or not, who insist on a 40,000 word cutoff. In that novella, which is what I think it is called The Border State, and it is a prequel to the first story, The Voluntary State, whereas this piece is simultaneously a prequel and a sequel to the original piece. And you do not have to read any of them to understand any of the other three. And you don't have to read them in any particular order. Because, I mean, there are things in there that, frankly, I intentionally subverted my own canon, and I'm puckish that way. I don't keep track of continuity all that closely in the things that I read and take on board in terms of media. And I'm not that committed to continuity, so I'm not using continuity. Anyway, the initial, there are stories about the future happening here. Well, not necessarily, but I always say the future happens everywhere. And I did not grow up in an East Coast city or in London or in Tokyo. And so when I was a kid reading science fiction, I loved it, and I still love pure quill science fiction. I also wanted to know more about what the future was going to be like where I'm from. And so I just started making shit up.
Let's see, there's an emotional continuity and a
Oh.
sort of feeling of narrative continuity, which feels pretty Appalachian also in its particular
Mhm.
way. Who cares if things necessarily line up between one person's version and another?
Exactly. Well, that happens in family stories and everything else, right?
Exactly.
I mean, my grandmother Rich told me the same story 3 different ways, I know, about breaking her hip on a trombone, and there was a mule involved. I don't know, there was... I literally do not know whether she actually broke her hip. I know she had problems with her hip. There was a mule. All right, you got everything. You got everything I know now.
Layers. So how did this project for these prison hills get started? Like, what drew you back to it? What got you going on the writing? Tell us some drafting stories.
Okay. Every year at the end of the spring, I go to a retreat center near Little Switzerland, North Carolina called Wild Acres to attend a writing workshop for an invitation-only writing workshop for professional science fiction and fantasy writers, about 12 every year, called Sycamore Hill. And Sycamore Hill is a direct descendant of this workshop called the Milford Workshop that Damon Knight and others put on in the 70s. I'm getting in the weeds here. Okay, I have to go to this workshop, which means I have to take a story. So every year I have to write a damn story. Or more sometimes. But this particular year I had to write a story, and I decided to revisit these prisoning hills, the Voluntary State Universe.
Actually never happened.
What?
Jonathan Strong.
No. I wrote the first version first.
Oh, okay.
I wrote a 12,000 word version of this, and then I couldn't really make it gel or anything, so I sent it to one of my editors, Jonathan Strong, and he said what it needs is to be more than twice as long, and it needs flashbacks.
Okay, that's true.
And so I went back into it, and we worked back and forth a lot. I think I did 8 drafts. and then eventually it got signed off on, and here we are.
So the length, it being a novella, we already sort of started to pry open this question.
Mhm.
How do you feel about the novella as a form in science fiction?
Well, I'm really looking forward to your novella, which is coming out in the spring? March, yes, all right. Also from Tor.com, the most exciting novella line in the world. All right, here's the reason that people ask me about this. I have, on more than one occasion, said publicly and with great force, there's no such thing as a novelette. Novelettes.
And anyone who's not in science fiction just nodded their head.
Well, okay, all right. A novelette is an awards category, not an aesthetic thing. Okay, it's science fiction and fantasy and mystery writers have made up these linked categories so they can give themselves one more award if they have novelettes, right? And I can identify, and I know, and I've seen critical work on short stories. I can identify, and I know the characteristics of, and I've read critical work on novellas, and I know, and you know, the critical characteristics of novels. There's no significant work that has ever been done on anything called a novelette, all right? It's a made-up word, Joel's like shaking his head. Do you agree with me, or you don't disagree? Or you do disagree?
I disagree.
Okay, all right.
It's a significant work.
I'm not talking about people haven't done. Are you saying done work in terms of writing at that length, or critical? I'm talking about critical work. I'm talking about Michel Foucault never said anything about novelettes.
When we're nerds, they're just long, short stories.
Yes, or in some cases short novellas.
Yeah.
And in some cases, I insist, there can be a work that is a novel that will be shorter than some works that are novellas, and vice versa.
Yeah.
All right. You people are glassing over right now.
What made this fun to write at this length? Since it started small and got big.
Oh, what made it fun was all of a sudden I had to go back into material that I had intentionally elided in the earlier stories about the war itself that is at the center of all of these stories. All of these stories concern a war between a Commonwealth of Kentucky that has come somewhat disassociated from the federal government, and a giant supercomputer that houses itself in the Athena statue in the Parthenon in Nashville. It makes sense. It does make sense in context when you read it.
So I'm going to jump a question because that led me really well into, there's a lot of politics kind of hidden or not hidden in these stories, and especially this one in terms of governmental structure and sort of how wartime organizing works between the Commonwealth and the voluntary state and the federals, and then just sort of our Kentuckian friends doing their own business like the Crow bands. So what did you want to work through that would draw you to that kind of complexity in terms of the politics of the novella?
Governments are no way to organize people. Governments are, are power systems. They're systems to inflict and control. They are. Who remembers Happy Chandler?
Oh, yeah.
Happy Chandler said that the purpose of government is three things: roads, schools, and charity. I'm down with that. Okay, that I can get behind. War, less so. And so I was exploring ways for people to interact with governments, both inside and outside of them, and acknowledging the deficiencies and efficiencies that can exist in governmental forms. It's it wasn't my main concern or anything like that, but it's something that we all have to be aware of in our daily life, so my characters are aware of it in their daily lives.
And it does feel very Kentucky to me in that way, that there are so many ways to work together between characters that have honestly very different opinions of government. Like, you have a relationship between your protagonist and her multi-times ex-husband. They're cross purposes, I would say, governmentally. So how does that kind of work as you're writing? Or do you talk about her as a character?
I'd rather talk about Marcia as a character. Marcia is a 61-year-old woman who has bad knees and is a war veteran, and is also the county agent, which means more than what the county agent means for those of you who know what a county agent is in Contemporary Kentucky. She is I mean, she's severely PTSD. I mean, I don't actually outright explore that directly very much, but every action she takes and every word she says is informed by her experiences in this terrible and insane and in no way understandable war that she and all these other people have gone through. And the South and even the very small county that she's in has just been depopulated. There are very few people left, and there's very little in the way of anything left. I mean, a big thing I wanted to do in this was talk about extractive industries in Eastern Kentucky. And so what I had happen was they take everything. They take the soil, all right? They take the streams, not just the trees and the minerals. I mean, they go all the way down to the bedrock. There's nothing left except the skeleton of the Appalachian Mountains. And things occur.
Which leads me into the question about world building that's fun, that I very much enjoy with these stories as a whole, and especially this novella, is that it has that weird fiction edge also. So you're getting a lot of very realistic sort of military arrangement in a way, but we're also doing an AI that changes the flora and fauna. You have the bears, which are horrifying. You have the big scary people robot things that are going on. Like, what was up? How did the world building work for you to mesh those things together?
When I was developing this world, and as I've been working with it for almost 20 years now, I've been influenced by a lot of different things. Some of the people in my audience know that I've recently become fascinated with this writer named Cordwainer Smith, and a critic and reviewer and scholar named Gary K. Wolfe compared the Commodores, who are the big giant robots in my stories, to these, I'm going to screw up this pronunciation, these big giant robots in Cordwainer Smith stories called the Menschenlager or something like that. They're descendants of German tanks or something like that. And that was an influence, not directly because I never read that story, but I think that somebody that did influence me had read those stories. And so I'm kind of like, standing on the shoulders of somebody standing on the shoulders of, etc. But everything is in there in terms of my influences. Old Warner Brothers cartoons from the 30s and 40s influenced the way I describe landscape. There's a point in one of the early stories where all of a sudden these guys are in the woods and there's this big fat raccoon walking by, and all of a sudden there's a chime and the trees start dancing and the raccoons start shuffling their lung and everybody starts singing the song. And also things from my personal life, from my family stuff growing up, observations, very inaccurate and poorly thought out observations I've been making about other people and the landscape my entire life, because it turns out I don't really understand people very well. And so I put that into my fiction, and it reflects back on me and it reflects from me. And I don't know, does that answer your question? Kind of get toward it?
Yeah. And again, keep saying very Kentucky, which back in the day when I reviewed the short story collection, Telling the Map, which is for sale, it is here, it's very good. What drew me to that, I think we hadn't met yet.
No, we had not.
We had not. Was that it felt like home in a very particular way, being from Kentucky. It's like, oh, this is like what the air smells like, and this is what the greenery looks like.
I love that review, Lee, because you said in the review, and I'm going to throw it back to you just a second, but the very first short story in the collection opens up at the intersection of Central Avenue and 3rd Street Road. While somebody's looking at the spires of the Kentucky Derby, and Lee wrote in their review that they were sitting in a coffee shop on Central Avenue when they were reading that.
Because I lived down there for several years, and it was the worst intersection I've had in about a whole month of the year, we all know. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Kentucky to my boots. I looked up some ancestry stuff through a friend of mine, and there have been Rows living and farming along the Green River in Kentucky since at least the 1830s, and there still are. There's one of them right there, and so it is, it's inescapable. But neither do I want to escape it. So it's not that, it's in no way prisoning.
I enjoy it, particularly in SF and fantasy contexts. And in the lit world, there's not a lot of books from here. Like, we love the ones that we have.
Yeah.
But I feel like for a lot of folks, it's the first time. if you're reading this novella, that you're really feeling the landscape as part of the story in that way.
Mhm.
And I really like that. That's not a question, it's just praise.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll be taking not questions but praise from the audience.
Ooh, yeah, now I get to ask the singing question. So, I didn't know there would be a song, which was excellent until like yesterday or so, but I had a question pre-written because singing comes up so much, not just among the Crow bands, but in reference to sort of church space and hymnals and those things. It seems very integral to a lot of the characters to process things through song. So why? What draws you?
You know, one writer, Tiffany has loved her own writers a lot, and there's one, a nonfiction guy, an ethnologist and anthropologist of the Appalachians in the Upper Cumberland Plateau named Linwood Montel, who lived to be, I think, 190 years old. But he wrote a book called Sing Down the Glory, which is about, ostensibly it's about shape note singing. Are you guys familiar with this? The kind of the way that music was written out before, as well as the way you've seen it on staff now. And there's a picture in that book of an old guy standing next to a chalkboard. And on that chalkboard, there are staffs of music and there's shape notes, and he's pointing to it. And he's a very distinguished looking old guy. And that's my great grandfather, Brother O.L. Rich, who taught singing schools all over the Upper South. And his children, there were 13 of them. My grandfather, the still thriving at 97, Stanley Rich, says, there was 5 of us boys, and every one of us had 7 sisters. But they were taught from birth to sing in harmony and to play musical instruments, and it was all built around the church. And they are, the singing riches have achieved their own kind of fame, and I'm a descendant of them. My brother is more one of them than I am, but I'm very proud of that heritage. Very, very proud of that heritage. I mean, my aunts and uncles and cousins can sing like nobody can.
As we all saw, you weren't too bad yourself. All right.
We're running right through these. What time is it?
It's 7:30.
Okay.
We're doing great then.
We are very
So, bonus question that I had thought of. I'm gonna pull a lineup that I had marked for everybody here. And I'm gonna make sure it's not too spoilery before I do it, because this really stuck out to me, and it seems very silly. But there is a line in which you're talking about this science fictional situation where the soldiers that she's heading are trying to get rid of some of the flora and fauna spilling out of the AI terror state that is Tennessee at that point. And there's a line where she says, the soldiers under her command called the duty weedy. And there was something about that I started laughing and could not stop for a minute. So I wanted to talk about language. Like, we're in the near future here. And so some of that is developed in that way, but there are so many callbacks to how I think we talk here. How did you work through that? Was that fun? Is it just natural?
I think it's just natural. I think my observations of linguistic change are that it happens all the time, but it happens with speed, and it happens with fluency, but it doesn't happen comprehensively. People hang on to words. There's actually, when I wrote the very first story and took it to the very first Sycamore Hill I went to, at which Jonathan Lethem made me cry, I should point out. It was, somebody in the critique circle said, I don't know what to make of this. There are archaisms in here. And I'm like, I don't think there are any archaisms in there. He said, the word botan is an archaism. And I said, I don't think so. People say botan. And but I don't know, maybe they don't some places, I don't know. They don't wherever that guy lived. And I want to jump way back to something because I just thought of it. When you were talking about the scary bears, and this is another influence, okay? In these stories, the Tennessee State Police have developed into this strange, technologically advanced force, and they have their Air Force are these giant balloon bears that kind of like float around like this. Now, there's a line in the first story where some of the crows, who are these crazy Kentuckians who think they can fight an impossible enemy by dressing up like birds, basically. Where they're fleeing Tennessee and they look up and one of the kids says, TSB's even got a bear in the air. Now, I have no idea where that came from, and I didn't know where the bear's from, but I do know where this line, even got a bear in the air, comes from. And that is from C.J. McCall's classic country song. C.W. McCall, yeah. Convoy.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad they've got along from Convoy to go with my related science fiction work. And I believe that all of us who work in the field should work towards that same goal going forward.
And now other people will quote that line and not know. That's kind of fun. So I think we're probably needing to soon audience questions, but I will ask the final question of any interview like this. What's next?
What's next is that I go home and tomorrow I finish the second book in my Tor.com novella contract, which is called The Navigating Fox. It's very different from these stories. It is connected to a story I had on the Tor.com website a year or two ago called Knowledgeable Creatures. It's basically talking animals and the Roman Empire and colonialism, I guess.
Yes.
And then I'm going to take a novel out of the trunk, or not the trunk, out of my grad school folder, which was this novel I've been working on for a long time called Sarah Across America. And the final third that I wrote in a white-hot heat in order to graduate from graduate school is absolutely bonkers and unsalvageable. So I'm going to kind of take that big pile of pages and work it into something else. However, between The Navigating Fox and the novel, I have to go to Sycamore Hill. So I have to write a damn story somewhere in there. So I'll be also taking suggestions during the praise portion of the.
And you can read that short story for free, by the way, on Tor.com.
Yeah, Knowledgeable Creatures.
So audience question time for Christopher.
And for Lee.
Or for me. Go to town.
Summer Sons, crazy Southern Gothic, scary queer stuff,
Yeah.
horny.
Not the
Yeah. I think the tagline was 1/3 Fast and the Furious, 1/3 Secret History,
Yeah.
and 1/3 Faulkner. I didn't write that. Marketing did a great job.
Oh, come on. Yes,
Yes.
you in the back.
So Christopher, like when I read the science fiction that's set in rural areas or small towns, like Ray Bradbury in Greentown, what springs to mind, he writes with a great deal of nostalgia. When I think of Kentucky writers writing about the South or Kentucky, I think of Robert Penn Moore, who writes with a lot of anger. Where do you fall when writing about the place that you come from that isn't Tokyo, New York? There aren't these places where you can set sci-fi just because they already seem futuristic.
So
Are you
what
a
I'm-
nostalgic writer? Are you angry?
Just to restate Tiffany's question, on the one end of the pole, you've got incredibly saccharine stuff that tells you more about Waukegan, Illinois than you ever wanted to know in your life. And on the other end, you got the Black Patch Wars and Night Riders and shit like that, right? And anger about racism and economic inequality and stuff like that. And I'm not the biggest Bradbury fan in the world. I'm sorry if I offend anybody. It's not saccharine. It's just not for me. But it is nostalgic. I don't think anybody can deny it's nostalgic. I think nostalgia is a trap. I think anger has limited effectiveness. So I don't think I bounce back to those poles. Those don't mark the continuum that I feel like that I write on. But I do acknowledge what you're saying. I think that I've been troubled recently when many people have been describing my work as regionalist, and I finally decided to own that because I realized ultimately that they were not calling me a local color writer. Local color is, in my view, a very, speaks to a certain kind of not that interesting, except in terms of some imagery, work, fiction in late 19th century generally, early 20th century, that kind of like trades in stock images. And I try to retreat from the stock into Rome and the Fae whenever I can.
I just read a book that I'm going to quote now about that. It was Vulgar Genres by Stephen, and I cannot pronounce his last name. It has several Z's in it. But he's he's talking about how fiction by certain marginalized people, we can be regional on this one, gets read as fake sociology, even when you wrote a novel, and it's that kind of energy that comes across in that, is that it's not about the art or the fiction, it's that you've reported something about your space that is presumed to be not important otherwise, or to be not part of the conversation. I'll also propose the idea of critical utopianism for you also, because it's not nostalgic, because you know what's wrong with it, but you're also sort of curious where it can go. I am from here, and I do love it, and I have critiques of it. And that's kind of the space.
Sure.
I see a lot of your
Absolutely. There's a fractured space there where there's an ideal, and the ideal itself is dangerous and reductive. So you kind of have to acknowledge it, you know?
I'm also on
That sounded pretty smart, didn't it?
Neither of those questions. Yeah. Excellent question. You got us, go. Who's going to be our second?
You spend a lot of time on research as far as going activist seeking things, or you just kind of everything taken from your part of your life?
Do I spend a lot of time on research? Not nearly enough, Rob. I can research so much more than I do. Oh my God, you know, you can't. You know how many novels per page you need, and how many reference works you need per page in a typical short story. I do research things and I will hair off into some random direction in the briar patch every once in a while. But it is true, I must acknowledge, that most of my work that is most effective turns out to not need all of that research. But that could change at any moment.
As an academic, I think Christopher does more research for this.
Yes, I wonder if Hollywood's optioned the novel yet. It hasn't. Who's going to direct it?
Who would I want to direct These Visiting Hills?
You don't know any director.
No, what about that dude that did The Secret of Ronan? Is he still alive?
Is that John Sayles?
Yes.
I believe so. He made Hollywood movie.
Yeah, John Sayles.
Jake one. Yeah.
A less specific question. Someone writing about the future and just like hearing you sort of talk, describe the kind of like extractive, ravaged landscape. There's war. There's giant scary bears in the air. Where does hope fit into that for you? Like how does hope function in your sort of storytelling mechanism?
It's absolutely central. I could not write. I don't think I could write a hopeless piece of fiction. I'm constitutionally unable to lean into hopelessness, which makes this an interesting world to live in.
It's hard right now.
You know, it's hard to read the news and then turn around and crack wise about something, but I do, you know, and I don't know what that necessarily says about me. I don't know what it says about any of
I
us.
should tell Tell's at school, but he has an epic fantasy he might go back to later. And he was reading Long Grim Dark, and yet the hero was immediately bad boy, bad guy, stealing a dog.
I don't remember stealing. I don't remember stealing a dog in any of those books. I read 15 Grim Dark Fantasies in December, and I'm not going to read anymore.
Hey, Christopher. Praise, you were just singing voice of
Oh, thank
expecting
you.
the song, and I was like, wow, you've got a nice little concert going on.
I also wrote that song.
Really? It's amazing. Congratulations. And also, you wrote a book. Novella. So I will admit I have a limited sample size, but These Visiting Hills, and then from what I've read of Your Navigating Fox, it kind of carries along with a journey, an expedition. Do you find that you use this a lot in your other works? Or
Yes. When I was working the plot, such as it is, of The Border State, that 41,000 word long novella, I was struggling with events and scenes and incidents and I was talking to a good friend of mine and a mentor, Karen Joy Fowler, and it's about a bicycle race across Kentucky in the future. And it is in conversation. It's in one of these pieces too, one of the voluntary state pieces. And she said to me, "You've got a race. You don't need a plot," which I think is kind of the secret of why there are so many journey narratives in general. It's like, hey man, that's actually pretty easy. You just like the next day they got up and went on down the road. Somebody asked me about something about Golden Age science fiction.
Well, not about Golden Age. For Kentucky or Southeast United States speculative fiction, what else are you excited about?
I'm always excited about anybody reading Terry Bisson.
Yeah.
Terry Bisson, Bisson. He's a multi-award winning writer. He was most active at the Short Links in the 90s. He still writes these little squibs of funny stories in Locust magazine every month. He also edits a line of novellas from progressive science fiction writers for an anarchist press called PM Press in San Francisco that are really good. And he wrote on my writers group, there are several in residence here. We're called what are we called? The Moonscribers. Alix Harrow came up with our name, the Moonscribers, and there are many great writers in it, including Gwenda and Olivia and Lee. Well, all right, I'm bringing Ashley, yeah, Ashley Blooms, I should say, you know.
There has been a banner year. Ellie Kilcoyne.
Ellie Kilcoyne is coming out. Yeah, we had
Right,
like
thank you.
8. There are like what are there? 9 of us? How many of us are there?
There's a lot of us.
There are like 9 or 10 of us, and we've had like 6 books come out in the last 2 years or something like that. And that's only Gwenda.
I've lost a second Bisson, and buried the lead a little. He's a major activist for decades.
Yeah,
and
he
decades also.
ghost wrote Mummy Virus on the Move, right? He is like, that dude went to federal prison because he wouldn't like turn over on his pals in the 70s.
In the Leatherman.
Yeah. I mean, he wasn't that close to, he didn't blow anybody up. I mean, Russia say that. But anyway, when I was in my early 20s and decided I wanted to become a writer, I was constantly oscillating back and forth between this idea of being a Southeasterner. I was in love with Carson McCullers, and I wanted to do something with that. But then I was this huge pure quill science fiction fan. I've been reading these moldering paperbacks and all these old magazines and stuff. When I was like 9 years old, my mom subscribed to Analog and FNSF for me, and it kind of, well, she probably shouldn't have done that. But then, so I was bouncing back and forth, and I couldn't do anything. I just could not settle on anything. And then I read this collection called Bears Discover Fire and Other Stories by Terry Bisson. And it's in print from Tor. It is one of the most extraordinary things you ever read. The opening scene of the title story takes place in the median of I-65 between Smiths Grove and Bowling Green. And it's about bears discovering fire, but it's also about elder care and about family and about loss and all of this stuff. But he's also a very funny writer. Sometimes he writes pure humor. Another great story that's under-recognized in that collection because only people in this room will really love it. It's called The Two Janets, and in that story, it's set in like 94, 95. Every major American writer moves to Owensboro, Kentucky for no connected reasons whatsoever. They just kind of like randomly all moved to Owensboro. Over the last, and I remember at the end of the Two Janets are these two young women who are like having this like high school reunion type thing, and they're going around up and down Frederica, and they go into this convenience store, and it ends with John Irving was reading the magazines, even though the little sign says you're not supposed to. About midnight, Joyce Carol Oates came in and bought a pack of cigarettes, and surprising us both, they left together. Anyway, look for that book, Bears Discover Fire. If you're from Anybody, if you're from anywhere, read Bears Discover Prior, that short story collection. Wow, French kiss. Chef kiss. No, French kiss.
I was heard on a podcast recently that Gardner Well, gay writer of much fame, who's also a native son. His next book is supposed to be set in Louisville. And none of his other books have been, so I personally am like,
Awesome.
yes.
Yeah. A question about the Golden Age of Sci-Fi.
About what?
The Golden Age of Sci-Fi.
The Golden Age of Science Fiction.
So I read a quote today. Frank Stempel, the old screenwriter, said, "If I knew I was living in the Golden Age of Hollywood at the time, I might have enjoyed it more." Do you think it's possible we're in a new Golden Age of Sci-Fi?
Oh, absolutely. But I think every age of science fiction is a golden age of science fiction, except maybe 77 to 83. Like basically the end of the new wave and the beginning of cyberpunk. Things got a little freedom there, but I'm sure that there are brilliant works from those times too. I would have to look at the awards list and stuff. In all seriousness, golden age science fiction is worth looking into for all kinds of reasons, not all of them aesthetic. But I've been reading all these memoirs of guys like Frederick Pohl and Damon Knight and all these guys that were active in the late 30s and on. And one of the great things about science fiction, or one of the weird things about science fiction, is all these people have like 60-year careers, right? There was a guy named Jack Williamson from New Mexico. He published a story every decade from the 1920s to the 2010s, I think. Isn't that right? Yeah. And it was good stuff. You know, it was like he stayed engaged, he stayed involved. And so my personal version of that is, since my first novel was a Dungeons and Dragons book called Sandstorm, which I should have filed the serial numbers off and published as a fantasy novel, because while Forgotten Realms Dungeons and Dragons fans hated it, people who fantasy readers who didn't read Dungeons and Dragons books, they kind of dug it, right? So that was cool. So that was my first novel. So that was my debut novel. But then Wendy and I co-wrote the Supernormal Sleuthing Service novels for middle grades. So that was my debut as a middle grade novelist, right? So this is I'm a debut novella writer in standalone novellas. And when Sarah Across America comes out, I will be a debut adult science fiction writer, right? I get to put on the gown and walk down the steps like 5 times.
It's like the new artist, Randy, where you're like, I don't know about that. I've seen you around.
But hopefully it's a different and wider audience each time.
Have any others?
Well, it's 7:49, so.
Oh, we got 1 minute. Come on.
So good.
Olivia.
How have the bicycle races been going? I don't know. I'm sure there's a bike race that you watch.
Oh, he's been, don't get back.
Actually, I did not watch the Giro d'Italia this year because I've been working. It's crazy. You know, with the deep streaming services that I subscribe to, I can watch bicycle races 275 days a year. Many of those days, there are 3 to 5 bicycle races to
I'm
watch.
not a bone to pick with people asking questions about